Welcome along to the Make It Count podcast. I'm here and my name is David.
And I'm here, and my name is Matt.
And we're looking forward to another episode. We're actually going to do another book review. It's a book by Joseph Folkman and it's called The Trifecta of Trust. Um, he starts early in one of his books and he's renamed the guy, but he calls him Bill. And he says he looked at him and he did all these 360-degree reviews. He'd done one with Bill, and this guy came really highly rated at championing change, establishing stretch goals, and driving for results. These are things that organizations want. They want people that can do the stretch goal, get change, drive for results. He was like really, really high, like top 90, like top 10% of these things.
Wow.
And he talked to him and said, "Oh, I imagine a lot of organizations want you, and that's really good. How's it with your team?" And he's like, "Oh no, it's bad with my team. My team don't like me." Um, and and basically, he was like bottom 10% for trust. His team didn't trust him, and it was actually remarkable that he could achieve as much change as he did because he was achieving that on his own. He would
Wow.
he would walk through walls, but nobody would follow him. He'd walk up the mountain and do the impossible thing, but nobody would go with him because they knew to him results were more important than people, and
Mm.
so they had no time for him. And Joseph is having this conversation with Bill and said, "Do your family trust you?" And he goes, "Yeah, of course." So do you want to like phone them and have that conversation? So he he phoned. 10 minutes later, comes back and he just said, "I have two questions. Can this be fixed? And if so, how?" He knew
Wow.
that the importance of trust, not just in his work, but suddenly in his life as well. And that's why I've got really interested in the concept of trust. I
Mm.
think it's often seen as something intangible. It's a soft thing. You kind of have it, you maybe don't have it, you have it a little bit, and it's good kind of to have it, but how important is it really? And this story and data around this would suggest it's really important. So, Matt, what are you hearing from that story?
Yeah, I'm hearing a few things. One of the things that's so remarkable there, of course, was um, he asked that question at the end, like, oh, so do your family trust you? Well, yeah, of course they do. Should we verify that, effectively? And then, hmm, okay, well, let's have the call. And he comes back, and clearly the answer to that was maybe not as much as he had hoped. And that was something that Joe Folkman talks about when they go and interview. He's specifically talking about leaders at this point, but I think, you know, it's probably might be across the board. But up to I think it was like a third of leaders basically overestimated how much their people trusted them, and he tells this really brilliant story in one of the videos of I think he tells it in the book as well, just how trust really is like salt. It's like the added salt. And he says he remembers when he was a kid and they went to a restaurant and his dad was there and they had fresh melon come to the table. And the first thing his dad asks is, "Oh, could you pass the salt?" And he gives his dad this like weird look, "What are you adding salt to a melon for? It's supposed to be sweet." Didn't understand. But his dad's like, "Well, try it, see what happens." And so he added a little bit and he said it was remarkable that it tasted sweeter, even sweeter when he added a salt on. He's like, "Well, how come? How does that work?" And he said, "Well, the action there, you see, with the salt is it draws the water to itself. And the water brings with it the sweetness, the flavors, the sugars in the water. And so you bring to the surface where that salt is more sweetness, more flavor. And so you're saying that's really what trust does. It adds to what's already there. If you just have salt, it's not very good. It's not very nourishing. It's not very tasty. You know the but if you don't have any, you're limiting the competency. So he was saying, the whole thing with if you're really competent in an area, maybe the whatever, that leadership, those leadership skills, but you don't have that trust, yeah, you are not going to be a great leader because people aren't going to go with you. But if you have if people trust you, but you're not very competent at those things, equally, you're not going to be a very good leader because you don't have the competency to be able to. So it's the added benefit, it's the added value to what's already there.
Exactly. And so I think just to give a little bit of background on Joseph Folkman, he's done this for decades. This is his thing, but specifically his thing is 360-degree reviews, which is where you take a person and you interview or survey the people who work for them. You survey the people that they work under, and it's just 300, and it's all anonymized, right? For a reason. So you can be open and honest.
Yeah.
And so he's been doing and delivering these 360-degree reviews for a long time. And now he's got thousands of these data points, effectively, millions of data points, actually. And he didn't go looking for trust. The data showed him that. It wasn't like, oh, I'm really interested in trust. Let's see if I can find out, the importance of trust. No, it was like, oh, this seems to crop up time and time and time again. Does the data suggest that? And he discovers it does. Like you said, he was like, if you're a really good communicator, you're like I can't remember what percent leader, but he said, if you're a really good communicator and you're trusted, you're immediately like a 70%, a top set, like 30% leader. You're just a really good leader just because of those two skills. People trust you and you can communicate. And it's that sort of added plus, no matter what you've got. And so it's really interesting, just some of the things that he draws out in the book about the importance of trust. So, Matt, do you remember? The book is called The Trifecta of Trust. What are the three things, the try?
Well, thank you for asking that question, and I'll scoop them right up for you. Trifecta of trust. So, well, this is at least what you summarized to me. Expertise and applied good judgment. So kind of competency, and then consistency, showing up, and then the relationship. So it's the relational aspect, the showing up consistency, and then the having the expertise in the first place.
And that was why I thought it was quite interesting that those three things. The first one, expertise and applied judgment. It was having the knowledge and the skill, but it was actually applying that in good judgment that people perceived it as. That informs good decision making, really. But actually, he gave an example in the book of a guy who came in, he thought he knew all the answers, and he went along to the board meetings, but he'd been like parachuted in from a different part of the company. And so he didn't really know what was going on. And so none of his reports trusted him. He eventually didn't bring around any change that needed to happen and was fired. Whereas this other person that came in from a completely different part of the organization, he said, well, if I do this, I need your support to all the people that work for him. And every meeting he would go to, he would take at least one person that worked for him to be like, you need to help guide me. You need to make sure I don't make any of these mistakes. And he asked so many questions because actually he wasn't the expert in the area, but people rated him as an expert because he asked the right questions and kept asking the questions that people thought, oh, you are an expert. You're asking good questions and you're using our expertise. And so actually it was quite interesting that even though in the book he sort of said, hey, it's about having expertise and applied good judgment, one of the stories he told was someone that didn't actually have that expertise, but asked the right questions and was perceived as an expert.
That's so interesting. I've actually experienced that quite in some engineering meetings that I'm part of. That maybe there's a lot of people, maybe there's not, but the people that kind of they sat and listened to someone, and it's very easy. So after someone's presented something, for everyone to go, yes, nod, let's all nod. Yes, that was presented. Well done for presenting. But the person who was really switched on and then kind of gives you that little bit of like, oh yeah, they're really thinking, and that is the person that then goes, I just ask a question about something. And it might seem like an obvious thing, but they were like, oh, I just ask that question. And it suddenly, oh yeah, that's an important part we need to think about and focus on or whatever. And there's definitely that aspect of, I think so much of the time, and I've wrestled with this as well, when I was at university, one of my biggest regrets when I come to the end of university is I didn't ask more questions. I didn't either in the lectures, and sometimes there's a bit of a social aspect, but certainly outside. I didn't go to the lecturers when I had a question. I thought I need to just work out myself, you know. And so there's something about being willing to ask the question, because number one, you do actually then learn and you're more likely to become expert. But yeah, this guy, for example, you don't have to be the expert, but you're trying to help everybody get that knowledge, and to be like, this might seem obvious to you, but to me, this isn't obvious. Can you just, and all of a sudden, an assumption has been revealed or whatever. And so, yeah, I think that's an important almost sidetrack there.
But yeah, so the second one as well that was interesting is about consistency. And it's not, as I understood it, about being a robot, about being the same all the time, every day, but it's about responding in the same way in similar situations. That was what I understood by consistency.
Right, I see. That's interesting. Yeah, because when I saw that and I was thinking about it, it makes sense to just go, well, yeah, someone that shows up, you know, day in, day out, or week in, week out, or if they follow through on what they've said they're going to, that improves trust. Whereas, you know, someone who is inconsistent, who says they'll do something, but then, well, sometimes they do, but sometimes they don't, or you know, they turn up at very different times when they've said they will. You know, that's difficult. I'd almost prefer someone who consistently turns up 15 minutes late, because you just know, okay, well, that's when they're going to turn up, rather than, well, they might turn up now, or they might turn up in 40 minutes, or they might not turn up at all.
But that was the bigger part of what he said consistency was. Effectively, you have to be really careful with the commitments you make. And in order to be perceived as consistent, you have to hit all of the commitments you make. So, and he uses the example I'm sure everyone has, but it's like, if you had 10 Smarties and one of them was poison, would you eat those Smarties? And it's like, no. Well, 10% doesn't sound like like a big number, right? If I didn't hit 10% of my commitments, many leaders go, well, it's all right, it's only 10%. It's like, well, actually, 10% is a huge amount of like not hitting your commitments. And that will make you untrusted. And so it really, he goes into just being really clear, like, if can you hit this deadline, why can you hit this deadline? Actually, if you can't hit this deadline, you need to communicate that, but you should have been upfront. You don't need to come in and try and do everything and accept every commitment, because then you will not be trusted, because you can't keep those commitments.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And you always see that just play out. The people that are more experienced in the room or the organization are less likely to just jump at yes, I can do that. Where, you know, the newbie in there, maybe it's because people take advantage of them, but you know, the freshman is always going, well, I need to jump at every opportunity and get the experience and say yes and yes and yes, because that will help. But actually, what you're showing is perhaps a bit of a naivete, but also perhaps a bit of, you've taken on too much, and so you won't be able to follow through. And
yeah. So he told us a story of, I think it's United Airlines, where a passenger was being forcibly removed from his seat, and there was a video of it that went viral, and everyone was like really like disappointed in the violence, but also in how the flight had treated that customer compared to other people. And they said their airline stock dropped 4%. Wow. And then, you know, they were the lowest rated like airline, like within like a year later still, because of that one incident, because they treated one person differently than everybody else. And so it was like, oh, but you might treat me like that, so why would I trust you? Well, I don't like that airline anymore. And so that inconsistency really, at a big as well as a small level, is huge. You know, for an international airline to, you know, basically lost millions of dollars worth of money, which is crazy, isn't it?
And that's in a sense, I don't know what people think of something like Starbucks, but that was, you know, that's the Starbucks effect, isn't it? It's not just that you know the kind of coffee you're going to get, you know exactly what the inside of that place is going to be, the kind of vibe of the music, the scenery, that's it is a consistent global, wherever you are, it is the Starbucks universe you've entered.
Yeah.
And that's why lots of people go to it, because it's like, well, I know what I'm going to get, rather than, well, I might get some really nice thing at this niche place, but it might be really weird and rubbish,
Yeah.
So,
well, we were on the Lagos Hope, weren't we? And we traveled around the Caribbean and Latin America.
yep.
And we had friends that really, I want to go to a Starbucks because I know what I'm going to get. And it doesn't matter where in the world I go. If I have was it a caramel latte or whatever it is,
Yeah.
it's going to taste the same.
Yeah.
And we had friends from the US say that. We had friends from South Korea say that. Friends from all over the world. And it's like, this feels like home somehow, which is crazy.
Yeah. How funny is that?
And the thing that's interesting about these two, so the first one was expertise and applied judgment. The second one was consistency. If you are not consistent, people don't trust your judgment and expertise.
Wow. Yeah, and that makes sense. Certainly in the regards of, like, if you're thinking from a work position of, I've made a commitment to do something and I don't make it, well, that does, it basically is either an error of judgment of my abilities, or it's an error of judgment of, I took on too much and I actually don't, follow through. And so, yeah, I think rightfully so, but maybe sometimes unfairly. But
And the last one, the third sort of trifecta, was building relationships. Ultimately, do people like you?
and it's that thing, I'm not sure if it's a quote or an axiom or something, but it's that sort of idea of, in 10 years' time or in 5 years' time, people won't remember the words you said, or even some of the things you did, but what they will remember is how you made them feel.
Mm-hmm.
And just how that is such an important part of, it's the intangibles, isn't it? And it's not to say that therefore the words you say and the things you do aren't important. They're very important, but also the how you do it, and the, do you see people as people or as tools, and resources to get what you want.
Yeah.
The story from Bill at the beginning, you said, you didn't say the quote I thought you were going to say, but in the 360 review there was this statement from someone, and I can't remember it word for word. I'm going to paraphrase it, but basically it was something that he was like, yeah, Bill's never going to forget this for the rest of his life, because it said something like, Bill is fantastic at getting the job done, regardless of how many people, regardless of the human cost and how many dead bodies he leaves behind him, or something like that. And you kind of go, that's why people don't want to follow you, because they find that they're going to wind up dead because you're going to have, used them, rather than, we're going together and we're going to make it through, whatever. So, yeah, what do people think of when you've been in a room and then you leave? What do they feel? That's what they're going to remember.
Well, and that's why it's really interesting. He uses loads of numbers through the book of just, if you are not trusted, if you're a leader that's not trusted, people want to leave, so you'll have a low retention rate. They won't go above and beyond. They will probably do slightly less than you ask because they don't trust you with themselves, let alone with their work. And yet on the flip side, if you're a trusted leader, you can go further together. There's more people want to be there. They're less likely to take sick days off. They're less likely to want to leave. They're not looking for other jobs. And you're like, oh, it just makes sense. Now, what was interesting under the building relationships bit, one of the aspects he talks about was asking and giving feedback. And he said one of the reasons most leaders say that they don't want good relationships with the people that work for them, their direct reports, is that they might have to say something negative to them. They want to be able to say that, like, honest, true feedback. I gotta come in and be the truth, tell the truth. He said ultimately, mostly they're not. Say I was working for you, Matt, and I did a project and it was 90% good. But you see that 10%, you're like, David, you need to get better at this 10%. But have you given me 90% positive feedback as well?
Yeah,
or if you only come in and given the 10% negative feedback? Because if you haven't given me 90% positive, then you're not being honest, actually. You're being dishonest. You just want to
Wow.
say the difficult thing. And that was like, that was a total, I think that was the main thing that reframed how
Wow.
I thought about honest and dishonest feedback. Honest feedback does not mean hard or negative, or it shouldn't do. It often does, but it shouldn't do that. It should be true feedback is reflective of the performance of the actual
Yeah.
work.
Yeah. Wow. That's
And
so interesting. Yeah. Honest feedback is reflective of the truth. it's,
yeah,
it's not reflective of the hard bit. That's
yeah.
really interesting.
And
Wow.
actually, he even talks about the love languages, the Gary Chapman book, where obviously Gary Chapman was a marriage counselor. He said, I know which couples are going to get divorced just by watching them talk to each other for half an hour. And it was that
Wow.
idea. If they say 5 positive things to each other for every 1 negative thing, then it's going to be good. But if the ratio is anything less than that, they're probably going to get divorced. And it
Mm.
and it, so he said that works in business as well. That's how life is. It's not just in your romantic relationships. And he said, so the leaders that think they need to be distant, that they can't have positive relationships in case they um, have to say something hard to somebody, well, you've got it all wrong. You're doing it backwards. You have to. You haven't sown. You haven't filled the emotional bank account that Stephen Covey talks about. You have to say the 5 positive things. You have to be there so that when you have to say that negative thing, it's not everything. It's not like, oh, you're going to lose your job. It's like, oh, by the way, this part of this 10% of the project needs to be better. How do we work with that? And so it was really interesting because he really goes into the details of that and goes, many people believe this, but this is not true and it doesn't bear out in any of the data. It's much better to have positive relationships to build them because then it allows you to be more open and true to people.
Wow. That's so interesting. And the thing that I find, obviously, we're off, many places are coming back into the office after having spent a lot of time completely locked down, but finding that people don't want to go completely back either at all or, so I currently am working half from home, half in the office, and there's lots of people that are like, oh, I don't really want to come back. And I remember quite early doors, people talking about, oh, these are all the benefits we've gained back. Like we've gained so much productivity because we don't have like the commute is obviously time wasted, and I can see why that. But they were saying, and also like just all of the normal chat around the office, people aren't distracted by each other and everything. Uh, and on the one hand, I think yeah, I can see how that might lead to quote unquote more productivity because you are spending more time on your work. But everybody across the board loses out on those relationships. And it just if a tiny bit by a tiny bit you drift in those relationships, I think in not a very long time you start to realize the team is no longer as cohesive. The team is no longer working as a team. And so, I've been trying to be really intentional with when I'm working from home, trying to make sure I'm getting on a call with a colleague, once or twice a day, just to make sure, hey, how you doing? What are you up to? And even if you don't necessarily cover a specific, we're on the same project, at least you're touching base and going, oh yeah, have you tried that? Or have you tried this? And all of a sudden, you've unlocked them from bashing their head against the wall for 2 hours because of a 5-minute conversation. Or tell me that's not productivity enhancing. And you also both feel better at the end of the day. And
Yeah.
so I think this idea of, oh yeah, we get more productivity, we're saving time by doing these is a false economy. Um,
Well, I don't know if it's a false economy. It was interesting because he actually does a whole chapter on COVID and remote work and the workplace. And he talked about this person he worked with. She was employed as a remote worker to bring around change. And she comes in, she's very driven and, makes a lot of changes, comes up to her like 8 month appraisal. And they were like, well, we think you do good work, but nobody trusts you. And actually, in all the Zoom meetings, she never had her camera on, never had her microphone on. So she never built any of those connections. And they said, you might not like being on Zoom. Most people don't, but nobody knows who you are. And in
yeah,
that absence of that, you have to really try hard. And so she goes away and she's phoning the board and the CEO and connecting with the different teams. She was basically at that point on the way out of her job. She gets this appraisal. She's really intentional with building those relationships. The next appraisal comes around and they're like, I think everyone likes you more than they like me. That was what her direct line manager said. but she's been intentional. And so remote is not an excuse. And I think I heard, I
Yeah,
wasn't
no,
sure if it's in
absolutely.
this book or somewhere else, but it's like, if you were a good leader, you did well, like actually improved. You made those touch points every day with your workers. If you weren't, it got worse.
Yeah,
There was that distance. I
yeah,
think well, I got one more thing I was going to say as we sort of round out this thing. It was really interesting to me, but I still think there are people that were like, it doesn't really matter how much people trust you. And he gives
mm,
this example and he says, ultimately, if people don't trust you, they don't trust your work. So you could spend hours and hours on a project. It could be expert, it could be brilliant and excellent in every way, and it's going to get dismissed because they don't trust you.
yeah,
It's like, well, if you really care about your work, then, or you care about how you're showing up, it doesn't actually ultimately matter how good your work is if it's going to get dismissed because you're not trusted.
yeah. That's really interesting. And so, it's not even like you have to spend an inordinate amount of time building these relationships. It's often the small touch points, and that's what I mean. I quite like it's an old book, but going back to the 1 minute manager thing, it's like 1 minute, and that's a management like 1 minute job description, 1 minute appraisals, 1 minute praising, 1 minute reprimands, and it's that whole thing of, yeah, you can actually do quite a lot in a very short amount of time. It doesn't have to be every week you're sitting down with everyone for half an hour. And I really like that idea of just, in the Zoom space, like being there, show yourself, be seen, because an unseen face yeah, who can trust that? That literally is like the in all the film tropes. That's the spooky, sinister sort of person, the
Can't see
masked
their
person,
face.
yeah. So I like that.
So yeah, that's the book. That's the trifecta of trust, and the subheading, the proven formula for building and restoring trust. And obviously, he goes into restoration of trust and goes, and it's really practical. It's very research based, but it's also very human as well, because
Mm.
ultimately we are social people that want to connect and we want to build trust with people. And ultimate friction is less when you have high trust. When we work together, it goes really well. We trust one another. We trust it will show up. We like each other's work and we like each other, and that really helps. Um, so yeah, let us know what you think about trust. It's something I'm fascinated by. I love to help people with that. I delivered some training on building trust a year ago or so. That was pretty
Yeah.
fun as well. But that's all for today's episode of the Make It Count podcast. Thank you for joining us, and hopefully we'll hear from you and tune in next week.
See you guys.